on this computer. Hello and welcome to a special meeting for Cluster API. This is a kickoff meeting for the Cluster API load balancer provider proposal. Thank you all for attending, and the main goal for today is basically to get a high-level overview of what we're trying to accomplish, what already exists in this space, and to start the proposal and start kind of assigning action items for next steps. So with that said, I think Moshe had written the previous proposal. So would you like to give an overview of your thoughts there, Moshe?
Sure. So I've actually been thinking about this a little bit more, and I think we don't actually need a machine load balancer. I think what we need is a machine service implementation, because we started with a goal of having a configurable load balancer for control plane and or ingress nodes, but I think that implementation would duplicate a lot of the effort currently in the cloud load balancers that are currently implemented. So if we were to implement a machine service that creates a standard service without any selectors and manages the endpoints underneath it, I'm pretty sure it will support a lot of load balancers out of the box. So I'm thinking NSXT and Cube VIP would work out of the box as far as I know. The AWS controllers, I think, and the Azure controllers would probably need a bit more work in terms of multi-account and multi-VPC selection of where the load balancers go. But I think those could probably be done. But I think if we split it, it might make it easier to implement and more maintainable in the long run. That's kind of just how my mind has shifted a little bit over time.
All right. I think the next thing would be a good overview of what already exists today, particularly within the vSphere implementation. Oh, wait, I see hands raised actually. Andy, go
I think
ahead.
Yassine had his hand up before me.
Sorry. Go ahead, Yassine.
So, like, I kind of agree with Moshe with respect of like just having a load balancer implementation. In the past, we've had requests that, for example, CAPV provides load balancer on certain ports to expose system level services, so binaries running on the machines. And I guess like if we implement some kind of either load balancer service, whatever we call it, and expose the notion of selecting machines and exposing ports and protocols, we might be able to build control plane endpoint support out of the box, but also enabling use cases for other folks.
Okay. Andy?
Motion, I was curious with the service idea you just suggested. I think I heard you say that we wouldn't have a selector for the service. And so I'm wondering, like,
So the machine service would have a selector for machines,
okay,
but then it would mirror to a service without selectors and then manage the endpoints underneath that service by itself. Otherwise, it will select empty no endpoints because there's no matching. So that's what I meant by no selectors. I don't know. I think people have referred to it as a headless service, but it's not a headless service. It's like an empty service almost, or a mock service.
okay. So when you say machine service, that's like a new type machine service, which is like similar to offering a new machine load balancer as a type. Your suggestion is just machine service.
Well, no. So the difference being a machine load balancer would actually do the realization of that load balancer, where a machine service, all it would do is a selection of machines and create the associated service and endpoint objects. If you wanted a load balancer on top of that, then you need to annotate your service with whatever load balancer annotations types that you want to get an actual load balancer out of it, and then copy the annotations from the machine service to the service and copy the IPs back out type of thing.
All right. Yassine?
Yeah, I think that another important thing is to actually define the problems we're trying to solve. So, are we trying to automate creation of load balancers, and are we also trying to make implementations swappable between providers? Say, I'm running CapV on AWS. I still want to use the Kappa implementation of control plane endpoint to use ELBs because I'm running on VMC, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think that goes to kind of the third item in the agenda, which is the scoping of goals and non-goals for this. I think I would like to try to see, if we can, find some common kind of consensus around, what those goals are between commonality of user experience between different load balancers and reusability of individual providers. But with that said, let's go ahead and jump into kind of what already exists with the vSphere provider. Can you give us a quick overview of that, Yassine?
Yeah, sure. So I can share my screen real quick if you want. I can walk you out through the code.
While he's sharing, do we have a note stock that we're working in?
I do not right now. I do have kind of a skeleton doc with just the kind of kept template, and I can paste that in and we can add additional notes in there if need be.
I just wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So what we have right now, like on the CapV provider, is actually an infra cluster being tied to a specific CRD through an object reference. So whenever you try to create a vSphere cluster, you would have on your infra cluster a reference to a CRD. And the first implementation that we did at the time was the HA proxy load balancer. So there's basically a CRD here that specifies how to create an HA proxy load balancer. And in terms of reconciliation, what we have, so if I look for reconcile load balancer, what we do here is basically there's a logic to check the load balancer that is tied to this cluster, and at some point we're adding the owner refs for it, and then we're basically copying if it's ready or not, and and also surfacing the status addresses that are on the HA proxy load balancer to the control plane endpoint that we want to use on the vSphere cluster. So this was done first when we were trying to implement just a machine load balancer. So it doesn't have all of the abstractions of grouping machines and whatnot built into Glacier API. So that's pretty much it in terms of and the HA proxy load balancer is a controller specific to HA proxy. So like the way I would see it is that it would be like if we had to do it all over again, like the implementations that we'd want to reuse would be standalone codes that we can apply and or remove whenever we're on a specific environment that enables, say, HA proxy, kubevip, ALBs, standard load balancers of Azure or whatnot.
All right. And to expand a little bit more on kind of the delta between what exists in vSphere today and Moshe's concept earlier, the big difference there would be instead of everything being kind of consolidated within the one controller and the one data type that's exposed in vSphere today, we would kind of have more of a two-level abstraction. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, great. So with that said, it doesn't sound like there's too much divergence between kind of what exists today and kind of Moshe's idea, other than kind of breaking that kind of the separation of concerns down a little bit. So we do have the shared doc. I did share that in chat. So let me see. The next part was the scoping of the goals and the non-goals. So I will quickly just scroll down to that part of the doc. And let me go ahead and share my screen while I'm thinking about it. I can't find the right one. So hopefully that's shared now. Is that coming through fine?
Yep.
All right, and let me try to figure out a way to get the participant window and chat back up. All right, so main goals obviously provide a common abstraction for load balancers between various providers. I know, at least from my perspective, having some level of reuse would be nice. However, I don't necessarily know how applicable that would be to all of the various potential cloud provider specific implementations out there. For example, I can see certain ones that would be tied specifically to specific instances that wouldn't necessarily be able to be tied to kind of arbitrary IP addresses as far as like the cloud provider implementations. So like you could, for example, take an AWS classic ELB, pop it behind various, have, something running, outside of AWS, and you could potentially put specific IP addresses behind that classic ELB. I don't necessarily know if that same type of implementation would be available through, say, an NLB or something like that. So I don't know if we can have full interoperability, but it might be nice to have at least some interoperability where possible. Does that kind of make sense? And Yassine?
Yeah, I think like actually like the bare minimum is having documentation on at least a matrix between the providers of cluster API and the providers for load balancer to say which providers is supported with which load balancer provider. And we could also imagine either an API or something that says if something is supported on a provider or not.
Yeah, and I think what I was trying to hint at there is I think we should make it a goal to not prevent, kind of using a load balancer with other providers, but not necessarily make it a hard requirement. Specifically because there could
agree.
be those downsides.
Yeah, and like in some cases, there's just no way of doing it. Like for example, if you take the vSphere providers on a VMC setup, the only thing that is possible to do is to have targets as specific IPs, since the machines are not EC2 instances, but rather VMs living in a vSphere environment.
All right. Outside of that, are there any additional goals that aren't?
I can think of a couple that, whether we spell these out in goals or motivation, I think it's important to say that we want the load balancer to work for the control plane, however we phrase that. And then related would be like being able to select which machines are backed for a load balancer, and then to try and find some way to do quiescence when we're doing rolling updates.
Okay, so load balancer should be able or must be able to interoperate with control plane providers. And do we want to call that specifically as managing the control plane endpoint, or not necessarily make that?
Yeah, I think I don't know, we can think about it and wordsmith later. The point I was actually trying to make was more like, I mean, that one's really important too, but that the load balancer, or whatever we end up doing here, needs to load balance the control plane, which I know that control plane provider is currently optional, and there's a separate discussion about making it potentially required that doesn't really matter here. But I was trying to highlight that the purpose of the machine-based load balancer is to provide load balancing to the control plane for the cluster.
Oh, I got you. So scoping it specifically to the control plane rather than arbitrary load balancing.
Well, I'm open to arbitrary load balancing. We can have that as a separate goal if we want. I just want to specifically highlight that we do need this for the control plane.
Okay.
It must be at least for the control plane.
Yep. Yassine?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any technical reason why we would have to limit it, especially since Yassine was mentioning a use case about wanting to expose ports on a machine through a load balancer, but they're not the control plane necessarily. There's some system services, and I don't see any reason why we should prohibit or prevent that.
Just in terms of the AWS cluster API provider, do you see any limitations of using the built-in cloud provider or the out-of-tree load balancer providers in
Before we go into
AWS?
that, Yassine had his hand up. I don't want to lose that.
So like I think that one of the worthy goals to add is we need to ensure that it's not tied to KCP, and that like if you have your own control plane, we should at least try and see if we can make it work generically before.
Yes, fully agree. And before we go too much further, I want to make sure that I capture the other things that Andy mentioned, which is continued reconciliation of members of the load balancer. and then there was one other bit, and it's eluding me.
Graceful.
Quiescent.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I think it's related to the continued reconciliation, but just specifically calling out that we want to be able to quiesce the connections, find some way that if we are terminating, or if we want to terminate a machine that's a member, an active member of the load balancer, we need to be able to remove it from membership, ideally wait for open connections to get closed, and then have a way to inform that the machine is fully out of the load balancing group.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. And going back, Moshe, you were about to bring up something else.
Yeah, but I think no, I think the term for pods for that would be graceful termination of members.
Yeah, I think it might not strictly be for termination. I mean, like we may decide that we want to take a machine out of the load balancer, but not terminate it. Yeah, so termination/removal.
All right.
Yep.
And trying to go off of that, any other kind of additional high-level goals, at least, and obviously we can wordsmith this and paint this bike shed 5 different ways afterwards as well.
Do we need to call out that the backends are machines specifically?
So when you say back end, you mean targets of the load balancer, not necessarily the load balancer itself, correct?
Correct.
Yep.
And also that they may or may not be reachable from the controller where they declared.
Yes. Target members of the load balancer will be scoped to machines and may not necessarily be directly accessible to the management cluster. All right. And then are there any specific non-goals that anybody thinks we should call out at this time? Yeah, Yassine.
I think that clearly specifying that we should bake this into the core cluster API controller would be a good one.
Okay. Implementation should not be tied directly into core cluster API.
So I'm not sure if I agree with that one, because if this is implemented as, I mean, I'm not saying that it should be, but if it is implemented as a machine service, then core cluster API would be the logical place for that, because there would be very limited impact on implementing it there, and there would be no dependency tree or cloud-based management. It would be a fairly straightforward implementation in core cluster API, and then up to something that's deployed externally to actually realize the implementation of the load balancer. So,
all right. I think Fabrizio had his hand up first.
And this is for another point. It is about the provide I think that we need a goal that is to provide an upgrade path for current cluster or something similar.
I think that makes sense. And Andy?
Given that this is going to be a new API or set of APIs, we probably should have a goal that it's like optional or feature gated or something along those lines while we play around with it before making any decisions about making it required. And then I had a question as well. So I don't know if there's only 3 minutes left in the original meeting. I don't know if folks can go after or beyond, but I definitely want to hear more, Moshe, about like just doing a walkthrough of your service or machine service idea and the separation of that from actually provisioning and configuring the infrastructure. I don't think I have a clear picture in my head how that would work. And I think for me, at least, it would be extremely helpful so that I can have some informed comments on where we go with this going forward.
Sure, I can do a diagram for this.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So I'll go ahead and I'll just remove this. Implementation should not be tied directly into core cluster API, and we can re-evaluate that after we get more information on Moshe's idea. And the next step before we kind of head out, I want to make sure that we get some action items for at least parts of this. I don't think we need to dive directly into the proposal pieces yet, specifically because Moshe is going to write up some more of his ideas there. So I think that'll be one of the action items. How long do you think you would need for that, Moshe?
Give me a couple days, maybe until next week.
Okay, I think that sounds good. I'll say 1 week. Moshe will provide more details around his ideas for service implementation. Is anybody able to provide some of the use cases and some of the requirements around upgrade paths, specifically around vSphere?
I can do that.
How long do you think
And I
you
can
would...
help you see.
All right, how long do you think?
Probably a week, given that I have other things.
All right, makes sense.
And then if also possible use cases for AWS.
Yep.
Because I think I'm pretty clear on how this would work outside of AWS. It's just the AWS use case that I'm not too sure on.
I think it would help specifically around AWS, Azure. I'm not even going to bother with GCP right now because we don't really have active maintainership of that project. It might be good to reach out to the OpenStack folks. And I can provide use cases around Equinix Metal, formerly Packet, and possibly DO. And one of the things I'll do is I'll make sure to capture the Equinix Metal, and I'll reach out to Carlos for DigitalOcean. So this is Moshe. This is Andy and Yassine. And sorry about going over a little bit.
I can provide some use cases from Metal Tree maybe for next week if we.
And that was Jan.
Yes. Sorry, I can't find that raise hand anywhere, so
That's fine.
just shouting.
All right. Around AWS, is there anybody who can provide that? I see Nadir's on there. Is that something that you can take care of, Nadir?
Yeah, yeah.
And then I'll reach out to Cecile and the Azure folks to see if they can provide some input on their end. And I'll also reach out to the OpenStack folks. So I'm not necessarily going to put down a timeline there, but I will reach out to those folks and try to get some input. Outside of that, I think the other action item would be is just kind of background on the goals and non-goals that we have set, and provide any other inputs to this doc that you want in that time. And would it help if I reschedule another meeting in a week to pick up next steps, or do we want to go async from here?
I think scheduling one would be beneficial, certainly to allow Moshe to present his brainstorming,
Yep.
if nothing else.
All right. Does this time generally work for everybody next week, or should I send out another doodle?
I'm good.
At least
Yeah.
for me.
It's good for me.
Okay. All right. I think that sounded mostly affirmative. So I'll go ahead and send out another invite for next week, and we can pick it up from there. Thank you all.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.
Deal. Thanks.
Bye bye.
Cheers.